Ngā mihi nui ki a koutou tēnei te mihi o te wā. We are here in the Social Services Select Committee to hear from submitters on the accessibility bill. So every individual submitter has 10 minutes and we mainly have individual submitters today. We have and are very lucky to have with us Stephanie and Rosie, who are our interpreters. And we will start with descriptors and ask those submitters if they're interested or need us to give them more detail. So with that, welcome to the Select Committee process. We're here till around about 3 o'clock. There'll be a couple of breaks in between. We hope technology is working well for us all. So with that, if we could have the first submitter, Roger Frost, into the room, please. Good morning, Roger.
Tēnā koe, Angie. Tēnā koutou katoa. Tēnei aho. Ko SS Oronse te waka. Ko Roketo te maunga. Ko Kawatiri te awa. Ko Ngati Tiriti te iwi. Ko Murchison te kainga. Ko Roger Frost taku ingoa. No rera tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to my submission today. In fact, I'd like to do more than that. I'd like to start by singing to my submission. That's all right.
Oh, wonderful. Sing. That's a great start for the day. Thank you, Roger.
This is a song you may remember from way back in your nursery rhyme days. Now there was a crooked man, and he walked a crooked mile. He found a crooked sixpence beside a crooked stile, so he bought a crooked cat that caught a crooked mouse, and they all lived together in a little crooked house.
Wonderful, thank you.
Thank you. I must admit, I've been running around like a chopped-necked chicken for the last 45 minutes trying to work out why I couldn't see anything happening on the website. Because I thought it started at 8:30.
Oh.
Anyway, never mind. I'm very much in support of the objectives of this bill. And in particular, I know that the Access Matters Aotearoa have suggested some strengthening to the bill, in particular standards, and I'm going to speak to that particular aspect right now. I want to talk about the crooked man, the crooked miles, and the crooked style. The crooked man, that's me. I have scoliosis, a crooked spine. I have osteoporosis, low density bones, brittle bones. I'm 79 years old. 10 years ago, I was diagnosed with those conditions, and they'll probably get worse. They're not uncommon, especially in older people. And osteoporosis is also much more common in women than in men. But they do affect mobility. That's the crooked man. The crooked miles. I'm still pretty good on the miles, up to 25 kilometres a day on dock tracks on the Queen Charlotte Sound in January. Walking is, of course, important, as you will be well aware. It's the most important form of exercise. It maintains physical health. It maintains mental health. And it's important for those with scoliosis. It's very low cost, no expensive equipment needed. And it has a very low environmental impact, much lower than biking, for example. It's also important to get off roads for safety and for greater health benefits. Crooked styles. With my scoliosis, stiles are becoming more and more difficult. And my osteoporosis means that if I fall off the stile, that is, I have a good chance of breaking bones, which could result in quite an expense for the government in terms of ACC funded treatment. Much better we have a fence at the top of the cliff rather than funding from the ambulance at the bottom. And that's where I come to my desire to have standards. I know stiles are good. I've built 3 stiles on our farm here. They're easy to build, they're cheap to build, and they're very secure when it comes to stock going through them. But as I get older, I'm finding them more and more a risk, and at times when my scoliosis is giving me trouble, then I find them impossible. I come across them on walkways from time to time, especially local authority ones, especially those that go across unformed legal roads where private landowners have fenced across them, sometimes illegally, and where councils, in our case Tasman District Council, has been asked to remove those barriers, and the council's first option is to put in stiles. I don't see stiles as an improvement in accessibility. Stiles can become a barrier to accessibility, and in the United Kingdom, where there are lots of footpaths across private land, local county councils now are funding the replacement of those with gates. The problems with stiles also is that they can deteriorate very rapidly, fall apart, making them almost impossible to access. So I support Access Matters Aotearoa in asking that the bill contains standards, a regulator, a barrier notification system, and a dispute resolution system.
Thank you, Roger. We've got a couple of questions here, and your time is nearly up. So,
yes, I realise that. Yeah.
I'm wondering if you'd like to move to questions now, or perhaps have some concluding remarks.
Yes, no reira, tēnā koutou katoa, and I'm very happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. We'll come to Maureen and then to Teresa. Thanks. Oh, Maureen, you're on mute.
Thank you. Anyway, I thanked everyone. Roger, you mentioned in your written submission about a disputes resolution process. Now, the bill allows for appeals to the taxation authority. So are you looking for something outside of that or in complement to that? What was your thinking around that?
Well, my thinking in dealing with the Walkways Access Commission and Tasman District Council is that there are pretty weak provisions for ensuring resolution. If the council is not particularly interested in pursuing it any further, then there's quite an involved process for involving ratepayers for getting that through. So I would like to see something within this bill that makes that much simpler and also almost automatic.
Okay, and I apologise. It's the appeals process is not the taxation authority, but I did. So what you're talking about is an appeals or a disputes resolution around design of those structures.
Well, yes, or even the need for improving access so that it is available to all rather than just to able young people like me.
Thank you. We'll move quickly now to Teresa and then we'll need to move on. Thank you for your submission.
Morning, Roger. Thank you for your submission. It was great, especially for your wata. Hey, it's a little bit the same as Maureen's, except I wanted to know, we've heard from some other people around some examples, some people of standards. So some people talked about the Kāinga Order standard and what that looks like in terms of percentage for housing, things like that. Do you have Any thoughts and examples of what you think is working really well in terms of that standards and the enforceable standards for people with whaikaha or disabilities?
Well, I've looked at various sites in the United Kingdom where there are standards for gates and standards for styles. I mean, there are gates that can be far more secure from a point of view of keeping stock from passing through. They're more expensive. There are some styles, very, very, and I'm sorry, I can't tell you the name, and I couldn't find it last night, where there are two posts that sort of open out like that, which a person can step through, but an animal is very reluctant to. So I'm talking about standards of that sort.
Great. Thank you, Roger. Maureen, I do see your hand is up, but we are at time. We might have a bit of an investigation, Roger, around that style that you talk about, because certainly, you know, technology and design is often a wonderful thing. So, look, thank you so much for coming before us and to starting us off with a waiata. Very lovely.
You're most welcome. Have a good day.
Appreciate that, and we hope you have a good rest of your day. You're done with us for the day, but I hope you manage to get out and enjoy the sunshine wherever you are. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Now the next submitter we have is Kate Smallwood. She's just coming through. So for those who have just joined us online, we are developing the Accessibility for New Zealanders bill. Hello, Kate. Good morning.
Morning. How are you all today?
Good, thank you. Now, Kate, do you need a descriptor of those of us in the room or on Zoom?
No, that's okay.
Great.
See you all.
We're going to be asking everyone this question. So welcome to the Select Committee. Thank you for your submission. You can take it as read. We have 10 minutes with you. If you'd like to leave time for questions, we'd really appreciate that. But thank you for making time to come before us today. Welcome, and we're in your hands.
Okay. So first of all, I'd like to start by saying that I used to work as a teacher aide. And while I was working with these kids, I met these really amazing children, people who had so much potential, but I was also really aware that there's a lot of barriers that these children are going to face. You know, these are the kids that could change the world, but they're not being given the opportunity as it stands. And I think it's really important to make sure that everyone has an equal opportunity, that people are able to access education without worrying whether that could, you know, potentially put a loved one in danger, to, you know, be able to access services that are really important to them and that they need. So first of all, I think it's a really amazing thing that this bill is actually in place and is being considered. However, I do have a few concerns. So one of the concerns that I had was the mention of reasonable accommodations. I would worry that it could be used to exclude certain groups by saying it's too hard to provide them with the technology that they essentially need to do their job. And that's concerning because, as you know, it means that we might end up in a position where some people are valued over others, and, you know, the disability community is a community. We need to make sure that everyone's looking out for each other, and we need to make sure that everyone's given an equal opportunity. Yeah, I don't like the idea that you would be able to say, for example, hey, this person has mobility issues. Okay, well, you know, we're not going to include them because we all have different perspectives, and those perspectives are all important. The other thing that kind of concerned me a little bit was that there seems to be a little bit of a double standard, and a little bit of lack of accountability on the part of the government and the minister. So a committee member can lose their job if they're deemed unable to perform their role, but there's no there's no rule requirement. There's no process to say, hey, the minister is not doing XYZ, or, there seems to be a lot of onus on the committee themselves. And I think it's important to consider the views of the committee and actually to treat them as equals. But, when you're saying, you've got to justify why you're doing this, and then there's not on the other side saying you need to justify why you're not, say, like, implementing a process or a measure or something. So I was thinking what would be a really good solution. One potential solution is, if a recommendation is rejected by the minister, there should be a stipulation that they need to justify why that was deemed too expensive or not a priority, etc. I think just to be able to say, okay, like, we're putting this all in place to ensure that people with disabilities have equal rights. So I think it's really important to say, hey, if we're not going to do something that's been suggested by the committee, there needs to be that onus on the ministers to say why. And I think one of the other things that would be really cool is, if someone doesn't have the experience, say, with business or with, with Parliament and the parliamentary process, because there are accessibility barriers and younger people might not have that experience, even if they are advocating for disability. I think it would be a really useful thing to say, hey, we're actually going to give you those tools and those resources and that education and that support. And I just had the belief that you're able to learn. Do you have any questions?
Hey, thank you for your submission. We have a question from Maureen and one from Liz as well. So Maureen.
Thank you, and thank you, Kate, for your submission. I'm just trying to understand your feedback about the minister having to provide some kind of accountability. So are you suggesting, or would you support some form of authority being given to that committee for any advice or recommendations that it gives to the minister?
Yeah,
some kind of authority to act, or so that we get that accountability backwards and forwards.
Yeah, definitely. Because I think one of the concerns that I have is that when you look at it, it's kind of like an employer relationship where the minister has the right to decide, okay, this person isn't performing in their role, but it needs to be more equal, because, at the end of the day, the reality is that we're not in these spaces. So when we are given the opportunity, like disabled people and the disabled community, need to make sure that there's that kind of equality that, so does that make sense?
It does make sense. Yeah. So the accountability, not just from the committee to the minister, but also from the minister either back to the committee or to the public.
Yes, definitely. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks. Thank you for asking that question.
And we've also got a question from Liz in the room.
Thanks, Kate, and thanks for a really wonderful submission. Sorry, I'm just looking sideways because that's where you are on the screen at the moment towards me. So you were emphasising some of the importance of education, and I think a number of the other submitters that have made submissions are talking about the importance of accessibility in education. Have you seen any models overseas, or know any good examples where education's worked with those involved with accessibility to come up with a way forward in terms of improving accessibility?
So I wasn't, when I was a teacher, I was kind of working directly with children. I wasn't really like looking at it at that high level. But I would say one of the main things, so I did actually look into doing a teacher training course And one of the things that I really noticed was a lack of kind of education and a lack of support for teachers. There's so little, like it's so difficult to find really accurate information on, you know, different disabilities, how to work with people with different disabilities. And obviously it's a spectrum, but, you know, having that basic information, this is what dyslexia actually is. Hey, there's this thing called dysgraphia, and, you know, this is what it means. Like, these students may struggle with handwriting or writing. I think that's really important to actually give teachers the support. And I think we're really good at doing it in some areas. And, you know, just like general things, but I don't know that we're always good at doing it with accessibility and with disability. And, you know, there are some really simple things that teachers can implement. I think, you know, it's seen as this quite expensive thing, but, you know, there are small changes that you can make to improve accessibility. But I think teachers, like, they've got so much on their plates and they're kind of left on their own to kind of figure it out. You know, I worked with teachers who are really passionate about it, but they've done a lot of their own research and, you know, gained their own qualifications and had to pay for those. Like, I think one of the things is that if you want to become a SPELL teacher, that should be funded through the Ministry of Education. And it needs to be talked about in teacher training. Like, I don't think it is enough. I think we talk about Te Reo, which is awesome, but we don't necessarily talk about, you know, what do you do if you have a student with severe anxiety in your class or a disability? Where do you go for help? Like, where do you go for support and to learn more? You know, how do you make sure that they feel included and welcome and accepted? Because so many kids don't feel accepted. You know, like, how do you learn to ask a question in a respectful way? And sometimes, like, how do you learn to look at it from the child's perspective? You know, it shouldn't be on a kid to say, hey, I'm struggling, because it's a scary thing for them. Like, no child wants to say, or like look stupid or feel stupid. So, you know, as a teacher, that's your responsibility to say, hey, like, I've picked up that you're struggling. How can I help you without making it obvious? Does that make sense?
Yeah. Look, Kate, we're at end of time, but thank you so much for your submission. I think that's a really useful one. Turns my mind to core competencies for teachers and training programs to ensure that they have the skills. But I guess that's across many professions, isn't it? It's like the medical profession or even architects, etc. So, hey, thank you so much for your submission and raising it with us and coming and talking with us today. Really appreciate it. Have a good rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you. Lovely day. Bye.
Bye-bye. So now we have Joe Bond. So for those of you watching on tally, and there's probably hundreds of you, we are here in the Social Services Select Committee for the Accessibility for New Zealanders Bill. Good morning, Joe. We have before us Joe Bond, who has 10 minutes with us. Thank you for your submission. Please take it as read. And we, if you'd like to leave some time, I know you've done this before, Joe, if you'd like to leave some time for questions, would appreciate it. But we are completely in your hands. Thank you. You're on mute.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, Joe. We're in your hands.
Okay, so I know that there's a common concern about the bill that there's the panelists of disabled and non-disabled people. Some people are concerned that why do we need any non-disabled people on the panel? I know that some people are carers of disabled people, and maybe they could be an exception, but we want representation of people who have lived disability. You have people who are Maori and Pacific and Asian who have their own representation and wouldn't be represented by a white person. But we have disabled people who may potentially be represented by non-disabled people. And to us, that seems not right because they haven't lived experience. Academic knowledge is not the same as lived experience. And we would like to see it changed. I applaud the fact that there are tangata whenua representation that has to be included. And that is part of the UN human rights. And I think that's great. And you can find plenty of people who are disabled and Maori who can represent Maori on the panel. I would ask that 100% of people on the panel are either disabled or have disabled children, because anything less is actually not authentic representation. That's the first thing. Second thing is education. I heard the previous speaker, and I have been that anxious person in high school. And I didn't realize that I had a disability. That was the problem. So I could barely concentrate in class, and I was highly anxious, and I did my best. I used to doodle a lot, but I was paying attention, and I wasn't treated very well by the teachers because they didn't have a disability awareness of people who can't concentrate. Later on, I would go on to acquire a brain injury in a car accident, which made me realize that I'm disabled, but made me realize that I had problems before the car accident, which made me disabled as well. So I think there needs to be more allowances made for people with disabilities, but I actually think that the teachers, it's a bit of an ask at the moment to ask them to identify a disabled student, because how can they do that? They're not equipped to do it. They would actually need a lot of training to do it, because how would they know the difference between someone who's just not seeming to pay attention and someone who has a genuine disability? It seems to be above their pay grade, to be honest. So unless we help the teachers in some kind of way, with some kind of education, I don't think it's fair with their current skill sets to actually expect them to know if the students are disabled or not. They really need some help in that area, to be honest. At tertiary education level, I had problems with sensory overload. I could not find a place, because libraries are supposed to be inclusive and more exciting than they used to be. I did not have a place where I could actually concentrate on my work on campus anywhere, not in the postgraduate suite or anywhere else. Even the disability department couldn't provide me with a place where I could study without sensory overload. And I actually think that all tertiary institutions should have a place or places where people with sensory overload can go, like study carols with soundproofing, where they can actually carry out their work without being disturbed by other people. It is a serious problem. It severely impacted me. People didn't realize they were making my life hell by the amount of banging their hands on the desk in frustration and everything else. And that could be solved with a few spaces with soundproofing that sensory sensitive people with whatever disorder they have could actually go and study. There's another problem that if you want to get a student loan, you have to do at least 2 papers. Do 2 papers to be a full-time student. You get limited full-time if you're disabled. You can't do 1 paper. I think that is wrong, and it needs to be solved immediately. There are some people who can only tolerate the workload of 1 paper. If their disability supports it, they have the documentation from medical professionals. They actually need to be able to study 1 paper at a tertiary institution and not 2. And that would help their performance, their stress levels, and even the stress levels of the academics who have to manage them, if they're able to just get a student loan with 1 paper, if they have the documentation to support it. And I think that that needs to change. And also think that public transport concessions need to go along with that for students who are disabled, who can only take one paper instead of two. Limited full-time could be one paper if the person is sufficiently disabled to support it. And you could get specialists, medical specialists to support that. It wouldn't necessarily be all disabled people who would be entitled, but people who have a certain level of disability could actually benefit from that. And I also think that there's some people who think that disabled people should have help with their fees, but I actually think that a better thing to do to help disabled people would be to help them with their living costs, to find the places where they can go that are accessible, which is very hard to find, even for non-students. Accommodation is actually more important than fees. Fees can be paid back once a person gets a job. That is the first thing I'd like to discuss.
Hey, thanks, Jo. We're coming nearly up to time. So did you want to leave some time for questions? We've got one from Anahila.
Okay, I'll leave time for questions.
Great, thank you. I just have to say as well, a really thoughtful submission. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll ask a question if Anahila doesn't cover it as well. Anahila.
Oh, thank you, Madam Chair. Kia ora, Jo. Thank you for your submission. I'm going to ask a question, but if you think that you needed to share whatever that you needed to share, do go ahead. I like the fact that you shared in terms of the student loan, you having to take up two papers just to meet the criteria. So thank you for that. In terms of the in terms of that, what I just spoke about, have you seen other good examples from, let's say, Australia, where that's catered, that's done well?
No, I haven't, to be honest. I think that New Zealand could be a pioneer in helping disabled students.
Yeah, and just one more supplementary, Madam Chair.
Sure.
Yeah, and in your opening remarks, Jo, about the having non-disabled people on the committee, do you think that perhaps having one person could actually be beneficial in terms of advocating for those of us who doesn't understand or what it's like to know what it's like to be disabled?
No. To be honest, I actually think that even one non-disabled person is not right to have there, because we've never had a disabled person be the Minister of Disabilities to date. I know we've had Mojo Mathers be a representative in the Green Party who's disabled, she's profoundly deaf. But I actually think that the whole panel needs to be disabled. There are IQ differences between disabled people, but there are plenty of people who have got enough cognitive functioning to provide an accurate picture who are disabled, especially if their disabilities are only physical and not intellectual, that I don't actually believe that we need a non-disabled representative there.
Thank you, Jo.
Thank you.
And Anahila did ask my question. So, with that, I don't see any further questions. Thank you for your submission, Jo. It's really thoughtful. I appreciate it. Thank you so much. Have a good rest of your day.
You too. It's nice to see you.
Nice to see you too, Jo. Bye-bye.
Bye.
So we now have Shannon Hennig. Or Anya? Oh. Okay.
Áine, that's the pronunciation.
Áine, is it Áine Kelly-Costello?
Mm-hmm.
But they're not presently here.
Right. We might just suspend the meeting for 5 minutes while we're waiting for Áine to come on. Okay, if we could have our cameras back on, team. I believe that Áine Kelly-Costello is now in the room. So if we could have your camera on, please, Áine. And there we go. Looks like we're starting to get everyone back in the room. Good morning, Áine. Thank you for coming before us in Select Committee. We really appreciate your submission. Please do take it as read. It is a really sound submission. Thank you. And we have, let me see here, we have 10 minutes with you, Áine. There are 4 of us here in the Select Committee and another 4 on Zoom. So we have 10 minutes with you. Please present to us, and if you could leave some time for questions, we'd appreciate that. So I think we will have some questions for you. Thank you. We're in your hands.
Kia ora, thank you for the introduction. And yes, I will leave some time for questions.
Thank you.
I speak to you as a Pākehā disabled person who is embedded in disability community in Aotearoa and internationally. Ostensibly, I'm here to talk to you about the Accessibility for New Zealanders Bill, and in particular, its fatal shortcomings. And that is what my written submission focused on. I do appreciate the acknowledgement that it's been read. But I'm really here to talk to you about ableism. To back up a little bit, in my written submission, I explained that without mandating the creation of independently enforceable accessibility standards, an Accessibility Act is pointless, but that the proposed bill manages to go beyond being pointless and is probably going to cause more harm than good by creating another layer of bureaucracy rather than enforceable mandates for change. Now, I'm sure you've heard versions of this very point dozens of times by this point in the oral submission cycle. When the Labour Party pledged in its 2020 election manifesto to create an Accessibility Act, disabled people really thought, I thought, there was at least going to be substantial progress on enforcing even at least some of our human rights. The fact that the government then put forward such a meaningless, toothless bill to supposedly fulfill that commitment has been disenfranchising and infuriating and caused many of us, including myself, to lose trust that the government has any intention to improve our lives with substance rather than only with rhetoric. So disabled person after disabled person, and also whānau members and allies, have told you that our role here, that your role here is to strongly intervene in order to stop the current bill in its tracks and to send it back for a complete rewrite, which genuinely listens to the disability community this time. But I want to focus today on the fact that right now, I'm not sure yet that you are truly listening. Just hearing our points, making some notes, and going on with your day will not do. Instead, I would like you to ask yourselves what you intend to do about the fact that this proposed bill is systemically ableist to its core. The suggestion of it, the creation of it, most of the debate surrounding it, the failure by most parties to oppose it, ableist to the core. Stay with me here. Ableism deems some bodies and minds less worthy than others based on socially embedded ideas like being so-called normal or being sufficiently productive or being smart enough. Systemic or institutional ableism creates the social conditions like shared belief systems or laws that entrench these views. You're probably thinking I'm exaggerating by calling this bill ableist to its core, but here is why. This bill is a token. The Labour government chose to take a long-standing ask of disability advocates and allies, to take its language, pretend they were listening, and twist it until it was unrecognizable and meaningless. If the government, for some reason, really believed a new accessibility advisory committee could improve accessibility, it would have created one years ago. As you know, no bill is needed to establish a ministerial advisory committee. The thing is, the government did not do that. It conveniently pretended to tick off the calls for accessibility legislation with enforceable standards by inventing the need for a committee. So this committee is a token, and this bill is a token. This token tramples on the mana and self-determination of disabled people, while disingenuously hoping to appease us. It lets the government score brownie points at our expense. In public, the government purports to care about making real change for a more accessible society. Transformative change, this time. In reality, it has no intention with reckoning with the degree of change that's needed to get there. So it places that problem, that thing that disabled people and whānau clearly asked for years, on the back burner. In other words, through creating this bill, the government is telling us that disabled people's human rights are not particularly important. It's collectively relegating disabled people to being less than, less worthy, and that is systemic ableism. I do realize you are not the Labour Party cabinet. You may not be responsible for the decision-making which led to this mess, but your role now is crucial. Please take a good look at the ableism you collectively perpetuate if you choose not to speak out. So disabled, sorry, just lost my place in my notes here. You now have every opportunity to send an unequivocal recommendation back to the government that the bill should not be passed in its current form, and that it should instead be co-designed with the disability community from the ground up. And yes, that will very likely mean that this bill won't pass during this electoral cycle. From a substance point of view, that's a moot point, because it's my strong view this bill passing in its current form will do more harm than good. So please, let's do better. Kia ora, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you for your submission. I think you've really expressed your verbally what you've written really well. Thank you. I'll come now to Maureen Pugh. She has a question for you.
Yeah, thanks, Áine. You're echoing quite a lot of the submissions that we've heard, but I do wonder, because our role here is to try and improve the bill as it is. And I wonder if you can suggest things that maybe we can do as a committee to improve it. And one of the suggestions that we've heard is that the committee actually has some delegated authority to act, and on the other side of that ledger, to ensure that the minister responds to those recommendations or advice. What do you say to that?
Yeah, my understanding is that it is within the committee's remit or possibility to be able to actually have this bill completely sent back to start again and rewrite it. I actually don't think that the bill is salvageable in its current form. It has some parts which could be worked in within the purpose, and of course I totally support TTDC being really strongly embedded in that, and the UN CRPD being really strongly embedded in that. But I think it's really incumbent on the committee to send a very clear message that a lot of people, have submitted to say that actually this bill doesn't cut it, and that we really need to start again. Because not only can the creation of a committee at this point, create harm by creating a sort of a bottleneck for accessibility issues, but the fact that it seemed to be like the Accessibility Act, now we've done the Accessibility Act thing, is very, very likely to just impede progress on actually getting enforceable standards under the Act. And that is where we really need to be going. And anything that's not going in that direction is going against what disabled people and allies have been calling for years, really clearly. Yeah.
Okay, understood. Thank you.
Could I just ask a question around your submission? You've talked about the need for an independent disability commission. Would you like to talk to us a little bit about your thinking around that? For those who haven't read your submission, that would be really useful for the community to hear. I think it's a well-made point.
Yeah, thank you. So at the moment, there is not an independent mechanism that is really resourced to be an accountability mechanism and be a place where research can be done, but where also enforcement of something like an accessibility standard can be done. Because government is always going to need to be one of the main things which is regulated by accessibility standards. And I mean, you can't, enforcement needs to be independent, monitoring needs to be independent. That's how it is. Like that's the only thing that's fair, right? And in order for there to really be the degree of resourcing, I think that while disability commissioners within the Human Rights Commission have done a phenomenal job with what they have, we really need to split that out into a separate disability commission, fund it properly, make sure it is led by disabled people, do it in a kaupapa Māori way, do it properly, but that needs to be at arm's length from government. Yeah.
Great. Hey, thank you for your submission, Áine. We're at the end of time now. It's 10 minutes. Appreciate the submission. Well explained and explored all the issues. So very useful. Thank you. Hope you have a good rest of your day. Take care.
Kia ora, thank you.
Thank you. Right, we're now coming to Victor West by phone, I understand. Great. So can you hear us, Victor? So for those of us who have just joined, we're waiting for Victor West to join us by phone.
Hello there. Can you hear me now?
Yes, Victor. Hello. We can hear you. I'm Angie Warren-Clark, the chair of the Select Committee. Thank you for coming before us by phone. Appreciate your submission, and you have 10 minutes with us. If you'd like to leave some time for questions, please do. And if you'd like me to let you know when 5 minutes is done, I'm happy to do so, or it's completely up to you how you deliver your submission. Thank you.
Yes. Well, thank you very much. What I want to begin by was, this is probably important to me anyway personally, but pedestrian safety, because I do a lot of walking. I'm a weight cane user, and early last year, just early in the morning, I prefer to go because it's not so busy, and this happened about January last year, and as I was going down the street, a silent vehicle came out and knocked me over and had my foot trapped under the wheel. Now, I had no compunction about, I couldn't hear nothing. It just was there. And unfortunately for me, I wasn't injured in any way. I was shaken up a bit, obviously, but I was able to, I asked the driver, he said, no, I don't have any, I just can't understand why these vehicles should be required to have a warning signal when they're mobile. And I believe it's called Audible Vehicle Alert System, right, which they have in America and UK and Japan, which is required by law, I believe. And yes, I mean, that'll be great, but I'm pretty, as I said, I mightn't be so lucky next time, but yeah, so I would hope the committee would take that into consideration when they're considering the legislation, that perhaps the vehicles coming into this country should be required to have that, and a time lag for the others that are in the country to have this fitted as part of their warrant of fitness standard. I guess the next thing I'd want to talk about was the local body elections, and which I found was, well, when the November the 16th, when that information became public about all the candidates standing, well, there was no information at all I could find about any of the candidates. I rang the local returning officer here in Invercargill and asked him if it's possible to publish the list of the candidates standing on our telephone information service, which the council do have, but nothing happened. And all I got was the print version of some of the candidates, of course, and then I had to get somebody to fill the form out and pick the candidates, but that took away my independence. So I'd like to say that I'd like to see the Electoral Commission take over this role. I believe they have that this would probably serve us much better in terms of our independence, where we can vote independently and perhaps get the list of all the candidates prior to voting and be able to listen to this through our telephone information service. The third point I want to take up was the Disability Advisory Group as proposed in the legislation. I can't understand why we need another group. We already have the Disabled Persons Organisation, which I believe are very experienced. They have expertise, they've come up from the grassroots, they know the issues, and I just can't see why they need to duplicate that. Why not elevate them and to give them direct voice as minister? So that's my three issues that I want with the government to consider when they draft this new legislation. The other things I'm very concerned about is the local council as it pertains to here, because we do not have any consultation as per a disability advisory group. Issues have been brought to this council and they've just been noted, but really not really worked on. The disability policy has been there for 5 years or 6 years nearly, and was supposed to be reviewed last year and it hasn't been done. And all the issues it raised are within the disability policy, and they said they were going to work with the disabled community. Nothing's happened. We have not got a proper forum in the council, and I'm just a little concerned. I hope at this point of time anyway, nothing's really moved. And I also want to touch on the bus transport. This is another area which has gone backwards in a lot of ways, that our bus transport has been decreased. The coverage is very poor. Audio announcements have been taken off. People are going to have to walk a long way to get to the bus, and people with disabilities with mobility issues will find that problem. And also the total mobility. Now, we've asked for committee meetings there to talk about one or two issues, and particularly the fare subsidy. It has not been reviewed for over 20 years, and we still haven't got any word about that. So we're sort of languishing right at the bottom at the moment and getting things moving here. So I think I'll just leave it at that. Okay.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Victor. I appreciate your submission. We have a question from Maureen, and then if time, I will ask one as well. Maureen.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Victor, for your experience in Invercargill. I just have a question about the alert system that you referred to. Can you please repeat what that's called so that we can get some information on it?
It's called, or it's the short, the abbreviation is AVAS. It's the Audible Vehicle Alert System.
Thank you.
Thank you. Actually, I'm going to pass to Liz Craig to ask a question. Dr. Liz Craig.
Thanks, Victor, and lovely to hear from you. Some of the points you raised in terms of local body elections and things, I mean, you've touched on it and said sort of some of the issues, but if you were summing up what needs to happen for a local election perspective for those with disabilities, what would be the key changes you would like to see?
Well, the key changes is, of course, a list of candidates and contact numbers and stuff in their CV, because I think I think that candidates standing in the local body elections are largely ignorant of, I'm being a wee bit general here, but I mean, for the most part, they're generally ignorant of disability issues. And we need to make them aware about it, and that's the only way we can do it. But I got to one meeting, but there wasn't much chance for me to talk there. But I would have, we've just not been, this is what problem I've got, because we want to know in advance of at least 2 fortnight before the local body elections who all the people who are standing and what sort of experiences they've got. And we could probably talk to them, individually and things like that. And that's not happening. And I just don't believe the people who are standing, really don't engage with some of the disability community, rather than just they come in with certain agendas and that's it. Because I think it's important that they really know what the issues are, like as far as we're concerned. But I couldn't detect any. I couldn't detect anything from any of the people in the community and the candidates when I spoke to them. None of them sort of were particularly asked any questions, I guess. So what does that tell you?
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you, Victor. We have come to the end of time with you. Really appreciate your submission, really useful. We've heard a number of issues in regards to flag down with transport and those kinds of matters. So your voice is being added to those comments as well. Thank you so much for coming in and submitting. I really appreciate it, and some great points made. Have a good rest of your day.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, then. Bye.
Bye-bye. So we now have Angela Marie Desmarais. I'm not sure if I've pronounced Angela Marie's name correctly, but hopefully she will correct me.
Kia ora.
Kia ora. I'm sorry if I pronounced your name incorrectly. You're possibly used to that. Is it Desmarais?
Desmarais.
Oh, completely wrong. Sorry. My apologies.
No problem.
So, from one Angela to another, welcome to the Select Committee. I'm actually an Angela Marie as well. We have 10 minutes with you. Thank you for coming before us. If you'd like to leave time for questions, please do, but this is your 10 minutes, so we are completely in your hands. Thank you and welcome.
Thanks. Kia ora. So, my name is Angela Desmarais, and I don't support this bill in its current format. So the Accessibility for New Zealanders bill, in my view, is not fit for purpose in that current format. Don't get me wrong, we need a bill that protects the human rights of disabled people. That's desperately needed, but this isn't it. It's underwhelming and very apparent that it doesn't set out to do what it's intended. So as you know, as you'll probably know, 24% of New Zealanders are identified as disabled, but people often forget that we're also women, Māori, Pacifica, rainbow, migrant, ex-refugee, etc. And there are many systemic barriers to equitable access that we all face. So we're often multiply marginalised. Sorry, a courier just arrived.
Always.
Does it need a signature?
Next thing you'll have a cat wander past. Happens to me.
Need a signature? Oh, I'm very sorry. Give me 1 second.
No problem at all. So for those of us who are zooming in or watching on Facebook, we are currently reviewing the Accessibility for New Zealanders bill, and Angela is back. Hello.
Apologies.
No problem.
Always the way. So we're often multiply marginalised. myself personally, I am disabled. I've got various mobility issues, which have me encountering frustrating access barriers on a daily basis. But today I wanted to talk more to you about the aspect of employment, and more specifically my own work life. So you might be aware of the latest labour workforce stats from June 22. I say latest because that's the latest for the disabled community. The general population receives those stats every 6 months, but we wait a year. So that shows that 41.5% of working age disabled people are in employment, compared to 80.4% of non-disabled working age. So that's a huge gap, and it's bigger than it was 10 years previous. So in 2020, MSD put out Working Matters, the Disability Employment Action Plan, and that states that 74% of those disabled people not in employment actually want to work. It's not that they're just, sitting around. They want to work, but there's these systemic barriers in play. And those systemic barriers often prevent them from being able to gain or sustain employment. So apart from the big barriers like transport and housing, and which I'm sure you'll hear from a lot of people about, and the undervaluation of disabled people, digital inequities are a massive barrier to employment, and just social cohesion in general. So I'll talk about some details of that. So I was told at a conference recently that I was speaking at by an employer that, they wanted to employ disabled people, but they weren't applying. And it turned out the job ad wasn't accessible. This bill doesn't change that. So when I want to share important government communications in an emergency situation, of which I could name many over the last 3 years, this week in particular, so myself and others in the public have to do all this additional labor to describe screenshots from, even emergency departments, from government agencies, from MPs, from ministers. We have to describe their screenshots, we have to describe their images, transcribe their videos, all because government comms are not accessible. And this bill doesn't change that. So in my job, I'm a policy advisor. There's 4 of us on the team. We're all disabled in different ways. And our jobs involve writing submissions, much like this one, to government agencies. So when we get sent consultation documents that are in PDF format, which is widely misunderstood because they're not accessible, instead of just, a Word document, myself and others have to pull ourselves away from our core work to copy out word for word the contents for staff who use screen reading software. That's a real barrier to sustaining employment. When government agencies should be providing documentation in accessible and alternative formats, this bill doesn't change that. And so even official comms directly aimed at the disabled community is often inaccessible. And this bill doesn't change that. There have been, multiple advisory groups over many years, constantly having advisory groups, but, advising on accessibility and such, but without effect, because the advice doesn't have to be followed. This bill doesn't change that. So if government really thought that making things accessible was important, you'd make rules to enforce it. So I'll give you an example. You care about road deaths, so speed limits are enforced. You care about people paying their taxes, so paying taxes is enforced. You care about young people drinking, so underage drinking is enforced. And you care about some building standards. Those standards are enforced, but not really when it's in the disabled person's interest. So, this bill in its current format shows that government doesn't really care about disabled people enough, because if they did, this bill would include enforceable standards. Accessibility rights need to be protected by enforceable standards, and this bill just doesn't do that. That's all I have to say today.
Thank you, Angela. We have 4 people lined up for questions. So thanks for your submission and well made. Thank you. We'll start with Anahila, Teresa, then we'll go to Tony in the room and then to Maureen. That was the order that I received. So Anahila.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I've got 2 questions, so I'll try one. Just my first one. All right. Kia ora, Angela. How are things in Christchurch?
Not bad.
Okay.
A bit more accessible than Auckland.
Thank you for sharing your insights. So I'll ask both questions and see if you could answer them. One is, thank you for sharing your insights. And I'm looking for international examples where what you have addressed has been legislated. And secondly, I'm keen to hear your bullet point number 4 talks about obligations under the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. In terms of Accessibility Committee on part 2 of the bill, do you think there are areas there that hasn't been covered or something? What are your additions you could provide in terms of part 2, setting up the Accessibility Committee?
Well, in terms of setting up the Accessibility Committee,
as it's on the bill currently.
Well, I have to disclose I don't have the bill in front of me. Sorry, I was in a bit of a rush. I couldn't find the document in my email. I apologize. So I'm not looking at it in front of me. But when it comes to the committee, I don't know, maybe I'm just skeptical. Just so many advisory groups with no enforceable standards. It's just another barrier to getting things done. Another committee with another committee. It's just extra layers of bureaucracy when where do these issues even go? And if they're not enforceable, how will any change be affected? So we need systemic change for the equity of disabled people, full stop. And the only way to do that is to have a bill that's co-designed in the true meaning of the word, co-design with the disabled community, with disabled persons organisations, and creating a bill that is enforceable and is actually fit for purpose. So you'll be hearing from, I imagine, many different disabled people pointing out real life examples from their lives that this bill doesn't address. And I think that's what should be the focus of the Select Committee, is looking at how can we create a bill that addresses what disabled people need, essentially.
Thank you.
Thank you. We'll come now to Teresa. Time is short, so if we could quickly ask our questions, would be great. Thanks, Teresa.
Thanks, Chair. Thank you so much for your submission, Angela. I really liked the examples you used around current enforceable standards. So thank you for that. I guess mine is around, my partai or question is around, I understand, and I'm hearing many with just like a full rewrite. However, I also hear from some that, you know, we need to, this is a start and we need to gain momentum on it. So I guess my question really is around, and a bit of a worry is around, you mentioned the comms that are coming out of government, especially like essential, you know, weather events or emergency comms. That really worries me that that's not getting through to people with disabilities. And I know this is not a fix up for everything, but right now it's essential we get that right. So you talked about having your own sort of network. There's about 4 of you that have to be pulled off your own job to, you know, get these comms out or rewrite these comms or screenshot or describe these comms. But is there any, I know that you want a full rewrite, but is there any short-term solutions right now? Because God forbid, oh my God, touching all the wood, there's not another massive disaster. We need to get those messages out. So I guess what I'm asking is how can we support that better in the interim? Not saying that we're not hearing the other stuff for long term as well.
Yeah, so just to clarify, I was referring in the consultation documents in my role. When it comes to the accessible comms, that's, you know, different part of where department and where I work, but also just the disabled community doing that mahi. I just want to bring up COVID-19. So I'm also a linguist, okay? My background's academia, I'm a linguist, critical discourse, that's my jam. I did a bit of an analysis during the beginning of COVID, looking in 2020, looking at government comms. I analysed minister and MPs' posts advising the public on level changes. None of them were, everybody was sharing, just sharing word texts, screenshots. And we're talking about official comms saying level changes, I think there was one MP who described their image, one of the whole government. And that's not specific to this government, it's specific to all governments, all parties, all, MPs and representatives. And the public service has an obligation to set standards through their policies and practices. So in a roundabout way of answering your question, government needs to set policies for all their staff. Every single new staff member onboarded needs to be trained, have some sort of awareness and accessibility, that PDFs aren't accessible, that images need to be described, that videos need transcriptions, you just don't know what you don't know. So I'm not blaming some people for not providing those descriptions or making their comms accessible, because they just don't know to do it. And it's government's job to enforce that, even within public service.
Thank you, Angela. Look, we are at time, but I'm just going to get Tony to ask a question. And then Maureen, I'm not sure if yours has been answered, but we are at time, so we'll.
Very quickly, that was around the translations of paperwork, because MSD put papers out around 2019 around the 5 different ways of communicating to people. Would you be finding that they're not even meeting any of those 5 points, as you're just saying, even though there's been a paper put out and is supposed to be circulated around all government departments? Would that be correct?
Yeah, I mean, just because the paper exists doesn't mean that all public service staff have read it as a starting point. But I spoke at a conference recently to a room full of public service employees from across agencies. And I asked the question, how many of you received any awareness training around accessible documents? 4 or 5, I think, hands went up in a room of like 60, 70 people. So that gives you an example of cross-agency awareness of this.
Thank you. Thank you. And Maureen, go on then.
Sorry, you caught me by surprise. Thanks very much, Angela. Look, I can tell you PDF documents are the bane of my life in this organisation as well. So you're not alone in your struggle to be able to get access to really good quality documentation. But one of the submissions that we heard earlier today talked around giving the Accessibility Committee some form of authority, and in balance to that, then the Minister having accountability for delivering on the advice or recommendations of the Accessibility Committee. Do you think the bill could be improved by providing for that?
I mean, there can definitely be improvements by providing some kind of accountability, definitely. How that works, I don't know, but it needs to involve the community together.
Sure.
Yeah, to advise that. Not one disabled person can't speak for all disabled people. Yeah,
No,
and just on that note, like acknowledging that I don't have much time, I just want to emphasize that when I talk about screen readers, I'm not just talking about the blind community, and because PDF, we're talking also about people who are neurodivergent, myself included, who use screen readers. And neurodivergence isn't just autism, it's also ADHD and traumatic brain injury and dyslexia. It's a huge proportion of the population would benefit.
Yes.
Thank you.
New migrants learning English, having, cool.
I know.
Thanks for your time today.
I know that we've strayed over a little bit longer than normal, but thank you for your submission, Angela. Really appreciate it. Good points made. Very salient. Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good rest of your day.
You too.
We now have Carolyn Peat by Zoom. Right, okay. But she is coming into the room, or Okay, so we're going to have Carolyn Peat by phone call today. But for those of you who are watching along at home on Facebook or whatever format you're using, we are the Social Services Select Committee, and we are working on the Accessibility for New Zealanders Bill. We'll take the opportunity now to perhaps give a description of what we are wearing and where we are sitting in the room. So we are in the Māori Affairs Select Committee room, which is beautiful, I must say. Lots of gorgeous carvings. There's always a sense of gravitas when you're in this room, absolutely. So behind and around us all, we have taneko, weaving, and we have carving. So I'm Angie Warren-Clark. I am the chair of the Social Services Select Committee, and I'm sitting in the centre of the room, and I'm wearing, I always seem to, whenever I describe myself, I'm again wearing polka dots, a polka dot shirt, blonde hair, and I must say, watching myself today, I realised extremely poor posture. So if the other members in the room could describe, just sing out when the member is available. If other members in the room could describe themselves, and then we will move on. So Dr. Liz Craig.
Kia ora koutou, I'm Liz Craig, Labour-list MP based down in Invercargill. I'm in the room today. I've got blonde hair and I'm wearing an apricot floral dress with a navy blue jacket.
Kora, I'm Tony Severin. I'm Act-list MP based in Christchurch, and I've got red hair and curly and long, so I stand out a little bit more than some of the others. And I'm wearing sort of a blue top with a animal pattern on it.
Kia ora koutou, I'm Jan Logie. I'm in the room as well, though mostly off camera, and I'm wearing a blue blazer over a black top, and I have newly short and spiky blonde grey hair, which is looking amazing. Very good.
So for the members who are in Zoom, if you could, maybe we could start with Emily and move around, just showing where you're turning up on my screen at the moment.
Kia ora koutou. My name is Emily Henderson. I'm the Whangarei MP for Labour, and I'm actually in Whangarei at the moment. So I have short grey blonde hair that is not as funky as Jan Logie's, although I wish it was. I'm wearing big dark glasses, a green cardi, and a blue and white patterned dress, and behind me you can see a very blurry view of bookshelves.
Thank you, Emily. We'll move to Teresa.
Kia ora koutou, talofa lava. My name is Teresa Ingleby. I'm the MP for the Ōtaki electorate. I'm in the Ōtaki electorate today. I'm of Samoan, Chinese, Scottish, Irish descent. So I have brown skin, I have long black hair, and I am wearing a red Kapiology, which is Kapiti t-shirt today.
Just dropping that in there. And you'll hear Teresa say Ōtaki a number of times today, I'm sure. Anahila.
Okay, kia ora, can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. So I'm Anahila. I'm the Labour-list MP based in Papakura in Auckland. I'm wearing an afro, red lipstick. I've got a pounamu on and a black top, and I'm at home.
Kia ora. Thanks, Anahila. She is indeed wearing an afro. Maureen.
Thanks very much, Madam Chair. Maureen Pugh, Nationals List MP based in West Coast Tasman. You can see a picture behind me of where I live. Short, dark brown hair, glasses today. Thank you.
Right, well, now that we've described ourselves, we still don't have access to the submitter. So we are scheduled for a break. So we will move into a break, return by at 11 a.m. Thank you.
Kia ora, Carolyn. This is Isabel, the clerk of committee, just to let you know that the committee is suspended until 11 a.m. And when the committee returns, we will be hearing your submission. Thank you.
Ngā mihi nui kia koutou, tēnei te mihi o te wā. Anō, welcome back to the Social Services Select Committee. We have now got our submitter that we were waiting to hear from, Carolyn Peat, on the line. Members, if you could come back into the room, we'll give it a minute or two until everyone is here, and then we'll roll across into hearing from Carolyn Peat, who is on the phone. I think that's the members. Just waiting for Maureen to come in. It's not quite 11 o'clock yet, so understandably she may not be here yet. But if we've got Caroline, can you hear us all right?
Yes, and it's Carolyn, please.
Oh, thank you. Sorry about that. I'm never sure, so I appreciate you correcting me with that. Carolyn, we have you for 10 minutes and we have your submission. It has been read by us all. If you'd like to leave some time for questions, please do so, but this 10 minutes is yours in its entirety. I am Angie Warren-Clark, the chairperson, and so we're all, there are members in Zoom and there are members in the room itself. So if you'd like to start with your submission, that'd be great. Thank you.
Thank you. Kia ora, everybody. My name's Carolyn and I'm totally blind. I was excited when I first heard about the Accessibility for New Zealanders bill. I thought finally we are going to have some legislation that runs along the lines of other countries overseas, of legislation that I as a disabled person have heard about for years. Then I actually read the document and I was gutted because it didn't live up to my expectations. Is this bill going to make any difference in my daily life? No, it is not. The fact is that on a daily basis, I strike barriers that make life difficult. Getting a hospital appointment in the correct format is a struggle. Getting my forms filled out for work and income is a struggle because they're not accessible. And finally, ladies and gentlemen, most recently, trying to put in a claim for insurance because of the floods here in Auckland has proved difficult with my insurance company. There is nothing in this bill to encourage or to give us a backup when companies and organisations and departments that provide goods and services to us do not wish to comply with accessibility upon request. Currently, we can go to the Human Rights Commission, but whatever resolution comes out of that is only for me as an individual. It's not complying an organisation to actually communicate with its customers, the people they are serving, to find out what works best for them. So, ladies and gentlemen, what I'm asking is not to throw out the legislation, but to make it stronger, to give it some teeth, because simply having an advisory committee to advise the minister is not going to be the magic key. I'm on advisory committees. We can advise until we're blue in the face, but whether people in authority take notice of that advice or not is up to them. They don't have to. So that's why I am feeling really passionate and asking you to consider to strengthen this bill. Thank you. And I'm prepared to take questions.
Thank you, Carolyn. Appreciate that. I think the point around enforceability has been made repeatedly, so we appreciate you talking about that. And I also appreciate the will it change my life question. I think that that's a really relevant one. We have two from the committee who want to ask you questions. We have Teresa and Maureen. So we'll go to Teresa first and then we'll move to Maureen. Thank you.
Oh, tēnā koe, and thank you so much for your submission. Really straightforward and really hear you. So with saying that, I hear around the enforceable standards, what other people have been talking about as well. And my question to you is, are there some, whether the international or here now, are standards that you see working really well and that you think you would like us to consider in terms of what that could look like?
There are some standards in the United States. In particular, I can only talk from a blindness aspect. I don't presume to know for other groups, but I am a member of Toastmasters International, and they have to comply with certain website standards in the state where they are located. So in the United States, various states have actually set up documentation and website standards where they must comply to a certain level of accessibility before they can actually publish.
That's useful, thank you. Okay, could we have, is that just a question? Maureen, and then we will come to Jan.
Thanks very much, Carolyn. We've had many similar submissions to yours, and one of the suggestions that we heard today was that the Accessibility Committee be given authority or some level of authority rather than being an advisory committee to the minister, so that it has accountability on the minister as well to accept or explain not accepting recommendations from the advisory or the accessibility committee. So I'm just wondering if you thought the bill could be improved if that was included.
Yes, and I'd be interested to know sort of what level of authority that committee would be given. So yes, I'd be interested in seeing that incorporated into the bill.
Thank you.
Thank you. And now we have a question from Jan Logie.
Kia ora, and thanks for your submission. I know you're saying that you thought don't throw it out, make it stronger and give it teeth. Do you support the United Nations recommendation that that be done in a co-design process with disabled people?
Yes, yes. Yes,
thanks.
It needs to be done. This is going to impact disabled people, so it needs to be done in co-design and consultation with us. Yes.
Thank you. Great. Well, thank you, Carolyn, for your submission. I think it's really well put and also very clear. I really appreciate you working with us on the agenda as well and coming in slightly later. So thank you.
I do apologise for lateness, but thank you very much.
That's quite fine. We're pretty fluid here in terms of our agenda at the moment. So thank you so much. Have a good rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Right, we come now to the submission by Zoom of Roger Loveless. Roger. Awesome. Thank you so much. Welcome, Roger. We can see you, and if you would like to take yourself off mute, we'll be able to hear you as well. Thanks for coming to talk to us in the Social Services Select Committee. We appreciate your submission. Take it as read. And if you'd like to leave some time for questions, we'd greatly appreciate it. But we're in your hands. Thank you.
Yeah, I got a bit of a transcript to think. I'll read something which I don't know whether if you want me to send it through to you afterwards on email, but I can do that. Anyway, my name is Roger Loveless. I'm a retired professional engineer, a full-time electric wheelchair user when I'm out and about and a wheelchair user when I'm at home. My disability advocacy experience includes several years serving on the National Council of the Muscular Dystrophy Association of New Zealand. I worked as an access coordinator with CCS Disability Action from 2010 to 2016. I'm now a member of their Bay of Plenty Local Advisory Committee. I'm also the Deputy Chair of St Chad's Communications Centre Trust in Rotorua. We provide life skill training and other activities to enable persons with disabilities to become independent and transition, where possible, into employment. We work within the Enabling Good Lives framework in Rotorua and have about 70 clients at any one time. In my professional career, I worked in and with various local authorities, giving me an appreciation of their planning processes. Bringing an understanding to my role as access coordinator led to several initiatives, and as such, I note the proposed legislation has almost no authority to impose requirements on specified entities. Working with a variety of local authorities enabled me to witness very wide differences in the treatment of access concerns, with 25% of our population reporting having some form of disability and 1% needing a wheelchair. Probably a rough guess, but that came from a Wheelchair Foundation document. Physical access barriers are a significant concern. Furthermore, the number excludes those who must depend on walkers, canes, crutches, sticks, and plus those with other issues such as sensory, intellectual, or cognitive impairments. Whilst I would have liked to see more enforceable provisions included in the bill, it appears that the appetite of government to do so is limited. Essentially, it would seem for a lack of evidence concerning the benefits that would accrue. As good planning is based on evidence, it's surprising how little is known about the disabled population in terms that can be applied in planning processes. For this reason, whilst working for CCS Disability Action, I began a program with the support of professional transport engineers to measure the prevalence of people using visible mobility aids out in the community. This as a proxy for determining how accessible places are. I applied successfully for funding through the Making a Difference program, championed by Dame Tariana Turia, to advance this work. However, this program was quietly dropped under the last national government, and the research now depends on support from understanding transport professionals. Whilst it could be argued that the power of the proposed committee to appoint technical advisory committees could cover a collection of evidence in the future, I believe there are two foundation issues that are sufficiently important to be included in detail within the bill and be adequately funded by government immediately or very shortly afterwards. These are collection of data and the interpretation of reasonable accommodation in the provision of services to the disabled community. The Enabling Good Lives framework, that with suitable supports with an inclusive society, the potential for persons with disabilities to contribute is significant. But what is the value of that potential contribution if barriers to the limit of reasonable accommodation are not removed? Should the answer be used in the allocation of resources by specified entities to plan such things as footpaths, parks, reserves, public transportation, schools, tertiary institutions, access to mobility aids, healthcare, support services and medicines? Under the present arrangements, the potential for many people with disabilities is never realised, and they have become almost invisible. It is therefore difficult for these people to ever contribute in society to the level they would wish. However, we owe it to the following cohort of persons with disabilities the chance to do so. This is really what Enabling Good Lives is all about. A few concerns. Footpaths. Having usable footpaths is a postcode lottery with varying levels of resourcing, particularly for upgrading older footpaths. Problems are uneven surfaces, widths below current minimum standards, insufficient curb cut downs, inconsistent use of tactile ground surface indicators and audible crossing warnings for the visually impaired, failure to upgrade older footpaths when usage increases, i.e. when cul-de-sacs become through routes, schools are built and new subdivisions increase traffic. Accessible toilets. Although some local authorities are slowly upgrading their public toilets, there are many older facilities that are not accessible. It should be a requirement that every cafe or restaurant above a certain size have a compliant accessible toilet. Access to commercial premises. Level access to such premises should be a requirement for all such premises unless extremely difficult. When roading and other public works are undertaken, it should be a requirement for premise owners to cooperate with the works funder to provide level access. This subject to the provision of suitably clear and robust definition of reasonable accommodation, a concept from the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Public transport. Although most urban buses and trains are now accessible with fold-down ramps where necessary, this is not the case for intercity buses, a number of public passenger ferries and taxi fleets, especially after hours. Affordable, accessible residential rental accommodation. As a result of reduced public housing, many persons with disabilities live in suboptimal accommodation and face barriers to retaining their independence, requiring support from friends, whānau, state agencies, etc. Whilst the cost of removing barriers is known, the value of benefits which could be applied in benefit cost analysis is not known. Any such analysis should be wide-ranging, not merely considering the savings directly concerning the person with a disability, but also the lost opportunity costs for those in unpaid caring capacities. Wider family members have limited options for outings, etc., because of the access requirements of their loved ones. It also frequently leads to those with disabilities being sidelined and not enjoying outings at all. I therefore fully agree with other submitters that the bill in its present form will not be transitional and become a missed opportunity. Commitment is essential from all specified entities, and I would suggest, as a minimum, the legislation include clauses to cover a clear, enforceable definition of reasonable accommodation and the collection of appropriate data to be used in all planning processes that have an impact on the lives of persons with disabilities. The enforcement of reasonable accommodation with respect to local authorities can be undertaken by ensuring that the receipt of any government funding for projects affecting persons with disabilities is conditional on making adequate provision for them. This could include accessible changing facilities at public swimming pools, curb cuts and tactile ground service indicators for at least both sides of road crossings when one side is upgraded, and working with commercial premise owners to improve access to a minimum standard when public works are undertaken in the area. The collection of data needs to be supported by provision of an initial set of default data for use in planning works where there are access requirements. These need to be added as a schedule to the legislation, supported by a requirement for specified entities to include them in their planning processes. Currently, the numbers of entities to include them, the numbers of persons with disabilities not in employment, education or training far exceed those for other groups. To these numbers must be added the numbers of non-disabled persons in unpaid caring roles. The next stage is to determine the economic benefit of giving the persons with disabilities opportunities within the framework of their enabled good lives in an accessible and inclusive society. Building on work detailed above on the prevalence of persons with disabilities in the community, I would suggest target prevalence rates in percentage terms be set for various infrastructure and other projects with an index cost benefit to be applied to cover the costs of providing accessible features for persons with disabilities. An example of applying the two requirements above would be the provision of accessible footpaths in parks and reserves. If, for example, expected usage by all people is 1,000 people per day, and we assume, say, 5% need step-free paths to benefit from the footpaths, then a figure of 50 times the calculated individual asset lifetime, probably in percentage basis, where the benefit value should be used to justify the provision of improved access, not just leave it. Yeah.
Roger, we are now at time and there is one question. Did you want to, because you're going to be sending that through to us?
Got one paragraph to go. Yeah, okay. And that was just, I would just say I would strongly recommend it. I was trying to find a submission to Hamilton City, which was very, very good from Judy Small. Anyway, yeah, okay. What about the questions? Yeah.
Okay, so if you could send that information in to us as a supplementary, that would be great. So we have a question from Liz Craig.
Yeah, thanks, Roger, and thank you for a very thoughtful and well laid out submission. A lot of other submitters, and you've touched on it yourself, have talked about the need for enforceable standards, but we have had some submitters mentioning, thinking about voluntary standards and kind of what the pros and cons are versus voluntary versus enforceable, and whether you could potentially start out for some areas with voluntary standards so that people knew what the baseline standard was and then move forward to more enforceability over time. But just thinking, what's your views on voluntary versus enforceable standards and whether there's any particular sectors that might benefit from one or the other?
I think there needs to be some enforcement there because there's such a wide variety of ways it's interpreted. I'm in Rotorua at the moment, and we're sort of collateral damage from other issues too, because I took a case, my son and daughter-in-law built a house on a subdivision not far on the outskirts of Rotorua recently, and I went to the papers about a lack of a footpath there. They say that footpath has got to be wait until the long-term plan. Well, the Waka Kotahi have a access a one network road classification system, which is different from what the district plan has here. It has a sort of higher level of requirement that actually says we should have footpaths to that subdivision. It's what they call peri-rural, which is on the outskirts. And basically it's going to have 42 subdivisions in the first group of people, first stage, and then more later on with children and things like that need to get into to school and things like that. The reason why there's no footpath there is that they're saying that their assessment is the one that should apply, not the Waka Kotahi one, which has a sort of higher rating. And I just despair at the treatment a Rotorua Access Group is given by the local council. They play lip service to us, but don't do anything. I mentioned
Roger, I'm sorry, we are at time.
Yeah.
This is very interesting, and I'm loath to interrupt, but there are other people waiting to make a submission. So if you could please send in your the information you were reading from, and if you want to add any more to the question that Liz has put, please put that in writing to us as well. It would be very helpful.
Okay, I can do that by sending some correspondence. I wrote to the Minister of Local Government the other day about that issue too.
Great.
Okay.
Thank
All
you
right.
so much,
Thanks
Roger.
for your time.
Appreciate your submission.
Okay.
Thank
Right,
you.
bye.
Now, do we have Áine Taylor by Zoom? Good morning. I think it's still morning. Yes. Good morning, Amy. I'm Angie. I'm the chair of the Social Services Select Committee. We have you here with us for 10 minutes. If you would like to turn your camera on, don't have to, but that's helpful for us. Turn your camera and your sound on. We have 10 minutes with you, and please take your submission as being read. Are you there, Amy?
Hang on a moment. I'm just having some technical issues.
Right. It may help to keep your camera off if you're buffering. But good. We can see you, Amy. Welcome.
Thank you. Ko Amy Taylor toka ingoa. I'm a hearing impaired person who also uses a wheelchair out and about. Owing to dysautonomia. I hope that my submission will be slightly lighter than Roger's, but he really had some very, very interesting things to say, and I enjoyed listening to him. So I oppose the bill as written. New Zealanders need concrete accessibility legislation that requires both the private and public sector to meet the accessibility needs of all New Zealanders and provides legal recourse when these needs are not met. We don't need another advisory committee. We've got disabled New Zealanders have been advising the government for literally decades. You know what our needs are. We sit here today advising the government and we're over it. It's not difficult to model accessibility legislation on numerous other countries who have already done this and have had it in place for literally decades. It's embarrassing that as a first world country, we do not have concrete accessibility legislation in place. In my written submission, I speak about my own unmet accessibility needs. These impose both financial and social costs on me and my family. However, the government is already well aware that there are unmet accessibility needs in the community. What we need is legislation that takes these unmet needs away and allows us to live full lives. As a hearing impaired wheelchair user, the lack of concrete accessibility legislation affects me personally on a daily basis. Here are some real world examples. If the owner of a restaurant decides to use their mobility toilet for cleaning supply storage, I rely on his personal kindness to move those so that I can use the toilet. Do you want to rely on the personal kindness of others so that you can use the loo? No, you don't. I have no legal recourse to support me, nowhere to report this to. If the art class that I want to attend is held in a building that only has stair access, I simply cannot attend. I have no legal recourse to demand that they supply access or move to a different venue that has access. There's absolutely nothing I can do about it. I simply cannot attend. If the university class that I attend has no working microphone, there's nothing I can do about it. All that I rely on is their own internal policies that say they should have these things. There's no legal recourse. There's nowhere that I can write to and say, listen, I hadn't got access to my university class because they wouldn't use a microphone. In another example, I was denied access to complete my teaching diploma as there's a full-time practicing component. I have no legal recourse to request that I do this part-time because my health condition requires that I cannot work full-time. I'm a straight A student and I have a diploma that is 99% complete, but I have a barrier that I simply cannot overcome. As a disabled person, I depend heavily on the accommodations made by others. And often that I depend literally on people's kindness, somebody who's willing to help my wheelchair over a curb cut that was not properly cut. I don't have any legal recourse. I can write to the council, but the chances of them doing anything about it is absolutely minimal. And it's a real life experience on a daily basis. My child's school is not accessible to me. I can ask them nicely to put in a ramp, but they don't have to do it. And yeah, other than the building code, which only applies to new buildings and renovations, there's absolutely no recourse to the built environment. And that really needs to change so that we can live full lives. It is my right to have access to the community, and it should be supported by concrete legislation. This cannot be achieved by the bill as written. What New Zealanders need is a set of laws that protect their access rights and a body that is tasked with enforcing those laws.
Thank you, Amy. Is that your submission?
That is my submission.
Wonderful, thank you. I think you've made your points very well. Do we have any questions from the committee? Oh, Maureen, I see your hand is up.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. Thanks, Amy. It was really good to hear your real world experience with your teaching degree. And I find it bizarre that there hasn't been able to have been some accommodating in terms of the full-time component. Placement.
Council, I've been through the union. There is nobody has chosen to make any accommodations for me, and I've obviously written to the university in the first instance. I cannot complete the degree as it stands.
Yeah, thank you. I think we'll have a chat about that when we're wrapping up our discussion today. But one of the suggestions that's been made about this bill relates to the information that you've shared with us, is that there is no accountability or enforcement in the system as we know it. So with the Accessibility Committee being part of this legislation, would you see it helpful, being helpful, if they had some authority to request action of the minister, and therefore the minister having to have accountability back to the Accessibility Committee about the responsiveness of their recommendations or advice?
I think that you are just adding extra steps to a process that is completely unnecessary. I mean, sure, it would be better than the bill as written, but the legislation exists in other countries. I can look it up. It's there on the computer. Nobody needs another committee to look it up. Take the Americans with Disabilities Act, take the equivalent Australian legislation and build a concrete legislation for this country. We don't need this bill as written.
Okay, so I guess that's where I was coming from, is how we can improve this bill, but you're saying you don't think that we can.
I'm thinking that's just another step that is totally unnecessary. I don't, yes, it would be an improvement, but I'm not aiming for improvements. I'm aiming for an actual concrete set of legislation. I mean, would I be happy with the improvement? More happy than if it was as it stood, but it's very much an intermediary step that I feel is completely unnecessary.
Thank you, it's very clear.
Thank you. Final question from Teresa, please.
Probably just want to say thank you for your submission, Amy, and like Maureen said, the real life experience, and it's probably around more what Maureen asked, and it was around those standards, but you made it quite clear that people can go and look it up. We have had some suggestions, I guess, or of like Toastmasters International, where they have that standard online, which I didn't know about. So I'm not saying that it shouldn't be our responsibility to go and look for it. It absolutely should. But at the risk of not trying to upset you, if there is anything that you think is closer to home, or something that we haven't heard from, or to consider in terms of what those enforceable standards could look like. Some people did talk about things that are not specifically disability related, but talked about, hey, if you care about people, young people drinking, we have, a legal age limit and we enforce those standards. So anything like that, if you did have any suggestions, but I know we can look it up as well.
No, well, I mean, for me, I think the building code in this country is pretty strong. And when the buildings are new, they tend to be accessible. And I mean, I can only speak from the point of view of a wheelchair user, and those are my accessibility needs, or physical accessibility needs. But if the buildings are not new, then there doesn't seem to be anything that makes people actually have to modify them so that we can access them. And the same goes with the road, like footpaths, as Roger spoke about. I mean, they're hopeless, basically. I slip and slide in my wheelchair all the time. It's dangerous. So I think if we actually look at our existing building code and say, what can we apply from here into older buildings, and actually get those buildings, especially government buildings, retrofitted out so that people can actually access them. I mean, I think that in a bigger picture, you're looking at the legislation in America and Australia, but on a smaller picture, that's what I would do.
Thank you, Amy. That's really helpful, and your submission has been well listened to as well. I really appreciate you submitting for us today. Really good real life experiences that you've shared with us. And I don't mean good in a good way, but useful for us. So with that, we'll move on to the next submitter, but thank you for coming before us today.
Thank you for the time.
Ka kite. We have the Dyslexia Foundation of New Zealand by Zoom. If we could have the foundation into the room. We're running a little bit late, so Namahi kia koe, Guy. It's good to see you on the Zoom. Apologies for running a little late. We have 15 minutes with you. Want to acknowledge the submission that you've given us, really, really useful. If you'd like to leave some time for questions, we'd appreciate it, but we are completely in your hands. Welcome.
Great. Thank you, and lovely to be here, and thank you for the 15 minutes. I really appreciate it. I loved Maureen's comment about bizarre when she was referring to the previous submitters, lived experience scenarios, and honestly, so many of the situations that we look at, you can only look at as bizarre. So often they can be resolved with common sense, but we need more than common sense for these things to be resolved on an ongoing basis and to change, New Zealand to the way that we want it to be. I'm wearing a number of different hats today. I'm the chairperson and founder of the Dyslexia Foundation. We've been involved in 20 years of advocacy. In 2016, we were involved in an inquiry, and the great thing was there were a number of changes that were made. But the problem with the last inquiry back in 2016 was that the things that really counted, the things that were really going to make a difference, were not things that were actioned. And I hope that that's not going to be the case with this legislation that's before Parliament. I'm also representing or speaking for many people who are not only dyslexic, but might have other neurodiversities, because we have a lot of experience in that space. I'm also speaking from the perspective of being the co-founder and managing director of Cookie Time Limited. So I hope to bring the voice of business to the table as well. I think that's a voice that possibly isn't well represented, and I can speak very strongly about that and answer any questions about how this legislation might be, how businesses might respond to it. And I'm also the father of 4. I've got dyslexia, dyspraxia, autism, Asperger's, ADHD, and severe mental health in our family. So I'm coming from a place of lived experience through my family members. It was 3 years ago when I first heard of the Access Matters group, and I was travelling in the South Island, and it was a Friday when I received an email late that evening, and further to a brief chat earlier that day. I woke up in Hamner at 6 a.m. To read the email, which was 100 pages of legal speak outlining what Access Matters wanted for New Zealand. And I was absolutely blown away with how this legislation, if it got through, could change New Zealand. What excited me also was that all the political parties were aligned. So I think that we've got a real opportunity here. The problem is essentially that what's before you to consider is it hasn't got enough teeth. When the DFNZ came on board with Access Matters, the first thing we did was to change the language to ensure that it included the lived experiences of being dyslexic or having a neurodifference. For example, for many, disability is a word that has become empowering and something to be proud of. And that's really important that we use that word for those people. However, for many dyslexics, they identify with it being a difference or a preference. So for the legislation, we need an inclusive definition of disability. I prefer talking about those that have accessibility needs, or accessibility is where the rubber meets the road, where you are disabled, have a difference, or are aging. Unfortunately, the proposed legislation is not going to work as it is envisaged. It has become diluted and toothless. Frankly, I believe that the way that it's being presented is pathetic, and we really do need to make some changes to it. This is a real opportunity to get it right. I think the path of least resistance has been determined by bureaucrats. And I think that the process that's undergone to get to the point that we are today has been diluted by fears and myths that are simply not real. This is not a big thing to do. It just needs to be done, and we need to make sure that we have the courage to do it. The good news is that despite what the bureaucrats might say, it's not difficult. They might, for example, say that business will be against it, but this is a myth that is utilised to dilute and create fear and inertia. It's time, in simple language, to push the bullshit button in terms of those kind of myths. As an example, with Cookie Time Limited, we've taken the approach of incorporating accessibility and accommodating disability needs of employees into our health and safety framework. Every business has health and safety sorted these days. We look for hazards with a magnifying glass every day. How hard is it to look for accessibility issues every day in the same way, and by doing so deliver emotional and psychological health and safety? So we're utilising the health and safety framework to bring it into play in the business, and it's just not a problem. And here's the kicker. When you look there, there are actually not that many accessibility issues to be found. It's actually a tiny issue compared to health and safety. And issues that are found are most often small and easily sorted. They are small things, but they do make a huge difference to those being impacted. There's also a commercial opportunity by tapping into the accessibility market. Supermarkets that extend hours and change the lighting and sound to allow those with sensitivity to shop without stress would be a good example. And the purple dollar in the UK is well documented as being something of value to business. And the other thing, just to wrap up the business comment, businesses already have the problem, so to speak. On average, 15% of their workforce is neurodiverse, and thus they already have a sunk cost with people who are neurodiverse. With a mindset shift, this sunk cost and the potential problem becomes an opportunity. With simple changes, people with neurodifferences can deliver so much more. So I think businesses must be included in the legislation. That's absolutely critical. And businesses shouldn't fear the legislation at all. It's actually a great thing for business, great thing for culture, a great thing overall. And although bureaucrats are a problem, the elephant in the room for this discussion is actually discrimination. Discrimination is the inverse of accessibility. It occurs every time a person cannot access the physical environment, transportation, websites, etc. With disability being a hidden difference, accessibility is most often not as obvious. Discrimination causes disengagement and disenfranchisement, leading to alienation, mental health issues, acting out, truancy and crime. On the flip side, accessibility gathers the disengaged and disenfranchised into the community and provides a pathway for people to feel valued and all the positives that come from that. Isn't that what we all want? The Human Rights Act and the process of seeking resolution simply isn't working. It lacks specifics and teeth, and it takes a great amount of time, effort, and cost to make a complaint. Something needs to change. It places the victim of discrimination in a very difficult position. So although we do have legislation around discrimination, that legislation simply isn't working. We have a number of complaints before the Human Rights Tribunal and Commission, and it's just the tip of the iceberg. If it was easier for people to show and to communicate the difficulties that they're having, and we had a process that acknowledged those and made the necessary changes, we'd find that a lot of the difficulties would go away. So in brief, the DFNZ recommends an inclusive definition of disability, an extended scope to include businesses, greater committee powers, a 3-year review and timely accountability to the House of Representatives, accessibility standards, a regulator, a barrier notification system, and a dispute resolution process to remove access barriers. So although we have the essence of something that is fantastic, it's miles off what it needs to be in order to be effective and in order to create a society that everybody agrees that we want. So the key challenge to Parliament at the moment around this is to have the courage to do the difficult things, knowing that the difficulties and the challenges won't be long lasting. It's not nearly as difficult as what we imagine at the beginning of the process. I'm certainly open for questions and to unpack any of those points.
Yeah, thank you so much, Guy. I really appreciate the purple dollar being brought into the conversation as well, because I think that, and the business side of things, I think it's a really important aspect. Now, the first question will go to Liz, and then we'll come to Maureen. Thank you.
Thanks, Guy. Thank you for a really comprehensive written submission as well as an oral one. One of the things that's touched on, you mentioned it briefly in your oral submission, but also in your written, is 3 years versus 5 years for the review period. Because often when we establish something or change something, it takes a while for changes to bed in, and then we can start to see how that's tracking, and then we can start to see what might need to change. Can you talk a bit more about why you're recommending a shorter review period?
Well, I think it just comes down to wanting some urgency and for wanting the issues and the opportunity to review to come, before those that review it a bit more quickly. I would lean on my business experience in terms of, yes, of course, it takes time to embed things and make things happen, but it's always good to review things at an early stage, just in case there are some very obvious things that need to change, and we simply save wasted energy. So just from that simple practical perspective, my suggestion is 3 years as opposed to 5. 5 seems a long way out to be reviewing things. It's really as simple as that. It's more of a practical issue from my perspective, having managed similar situations but in a different context before.
Thanks, Guy. We'll come to Maureen now.
Thanks very much, Madam Chair. Thanks so much, Guy. We could probably extend this conversation for the rest of the day, but I'm likely to only get 1 or 2 questions. So can I start with the greater committee powers? We've talked a bit about this today. So in terms of the committee powers, because what we're trying to do is improve this bill, and there is obviously scope for a larger piece of work, but the committee as it is advisory to the minister. So what can you see us doing to strengthen the bill to perhaps give that committee more authority?
Well, I think we've framed this up as kind of a committee about a committee about a committee, and we know that although there can be a lot of benefits from that process, when it comes to these issues, we really need a more regulatory approach being taken. It's like health and safety. I mean, before we actually added some teeth to the Health and Safety Act, people gave lip service to health and safety. You often, took the mickey out of it. Oh yeah, health and safety need 2 ladders, 3 people, all the rest of it. I think that in terms of health and safety, everybody, including myself, has gone through a journey of a blasé approach to knowing how important it is, and also knowing how it's a mindset. Okay, and I think that that's what we need here. And if we've just got a committee considering the issues and referring those up to the minister, all we're going to do is get more talk. What we need is walk, okay, and we need some real teeth in it. The health and safety, what's happened with health and safety in New Zealand, and the improvements that we've seen, and the way that businesses have responded and people have responded, that's what we need to happen here. And we've got a blueprint for what we need. And I mean, health and safety has some pretty strong regulatory requirements, and if you don't attend to those responsibly, then there are very real consequences. And fortunately, not that many people have to see the consequences because they recognise that they need to make the change before that. And that's what we need here. It's just we need something to really push this across the line.
Okay. Have I got another one, Madam Chair?
Yes, we do have a question from Tony here as well, though. So
let her go.
Yeah, it's fine. Go for it, Maureen.
Okay, thank you. The other one is in terms of the business. Look, the Purple Pound information was amazing. That untapped customer base, for example. But when you're an employer and you're in an employment market where there is very few available workers, how do you as a business owner then balance perhaps the perceived risk of employing someone with a disability versus someone who is seen more as either able-bodied or more better cognitive skills? And I use the example of myself having worked with a boss who had dyslexia, and because I did the back house support and accounts for him, I had to be really vigilant of him transposing numbers because they could make quite a big difference to the accounting system. So, how do you manage as an employer that risk, and how do you encourage people to be open about their condition so that you can accommodate them?
Well, the great news here is that every business in New Zealand already has neurodiverse individuals working in their workforce already. So the good news is the problem already exists, okay? And therefore, if we make it safe through legislation for a neurodiverse individual to disclose that they've got difficulties in numbers or difficulties in words or difficulties with sensory issues, if we make it safe for them, then they're going to start to talk about it to their employer, okay? And the employer will have to take action. Now, for many employers, I appreciate with the lack of understanding that they have about neurodiversity, that might sound like a lot of work to do, a lot of potential difficulties and problems. the good news is that the problem is never that as big as what they think it is. And with understanding, the reality is that those people can become even more empowered and capable employees. So we don't need to worry about new people coming into the workforce. We've already got the opportunity, and that's people that are already in the workplace now. We just need them to come out and say, this is what my needs are. And now, because of this legislation, I have a right to disclose that, and I have a reasonable expectation that something's going to be done about it. So I don't think that's a problem at all to be worried about, because the problem already exists. And for businesses, it's a sunk cost. So, you know, we already have 15% of our workforce, which we're already paying for. We can't remove from the workplace, okay? It's already a sunk cost. What we can do now is we can make that sunk cost work for us even more by empowering and supporting and providing simple accommodations in the workplace to get more out of those people that are already employed. So at no level is this a problem for business, as I see it.
Great. Thank you, Guy. Unfortunately, we've actually come to the end of our time now, but both Tony and Jan did have some questions for you, and perhaps we can maybe send those on or ask them in another forum, I'm not sure. But look, thank you so much for your submission. Really thoughtful, very useful. Brought up a couple of points that haven't been raised before, and I really appreciate the business perspective, in particular, you know, the PCBU issue as well. So I appreciate that. But we do need to move on, unfortunately, to have everyone heard today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. So we now have Victoria Edwards by Zoom, and I am going to hand the chairing over to Anahila Konoata Suzuki for a couple of minutes while I exit the room for a moment. So I'll leave you, Anahila, to introduce Vicky. Thank you.
Oh, kia ora, Vicky. Welcome to the Social Services Committee. It's over to you now. Would you like us to explain what we are descriptors, or are you all good? Thank you. Welcome.
I'll do a brief description of myself. I'm Fahia. I have dark blonde, wavy, medium hair. I'm wearing glasses with black rims. I'm wearing a shirt covered in different dog breeds, and my background is blurred because it's a bit messy back there. So, Tēnā koutou, thank you for having me. I want to apologize for how short my written submission was, so I really appreciate this time to expand. So I'll get into it. When I started thinking about what I wanted to talk about today, I was listing in my head the specifics of how an inaccessible society has impacted me and my family, but then I stopped and I realized I actually don't want to plead anymore. I don't want to plead for you to see the need for a more accessible society. I actually believe we should be a bit further than that. If you're not aware of how inaccessible and dangerous the current reality is for our disabled and why what's been presented here isn't enough, I beg you to give us the respect of becoming more curious. No able-bodied person gets a say in this. It's not anyone's say. It's simply not their place. And disabled people are pretty united in saying this bill isn't enough. I'm a disabled person with a story, but I'm not going to describe my conditions or my partner's or my child's because I don't really want to justify myself anymore. I don't want to hope I'll be believed, and I'm tired of feeling humiliated and lesser. So what I am going to say is I need to raise my child in a more safe, equitable, accessible society, and that's the gentleman's job to get that, to make that happen. So as I mentioned, I have experience of having recently lived in Ontario, Canada. This accent of mine is from further south, so it was a different culture to experience having lived in Canada. We also lived in Quebec, which was highly different around this topic, which is really interesting because they're right next to each other. You walk across the bridge. A kind of cute but sad culture shock my partner had when we came here was actually around this. One of the first things he noticed, he came to me and said, "Hun, where are the accessibility buttons on the buildings?" Or then it was like, "Why do playgrounds have bark?" Or my work has a ramp, but then there's like this small manual door. I don't understand. So I think when you kind of live with this stuff, you start taking it for granted. You don't really see it until it's not there anymore. So you'll hopefully be aware of Ontario's Accessibility Act. We have a bit of a blueprint there. There's a lot of good in that. There are some blind spots. There has been hiccups, but I think there are things we can really learn from that process. What I especially wanted to highlight from my experience with the change of power dynamics, I attribute to this, their act. And I attribute it to that because of how different it was in Quebec, even though they're so close. So in Ontario, not only is an employer bound to comply with any accessibility requests you have, they're legally responsible for offering accommodations without you ever even having disclosed a disability. So they should generally be informed enough and aware enough and like on the lookout enough to preemptively offer accommodations. So you also never have to disclose why you need accommodations. They aren't allowed to ask you any questions at any stage from interview onwards. So no explanations, just trust. So for me, this goes some way to start to change the power imbalance that comes with existing as a disabled person in society. It's not on you as a marginalized person to do the mahi, it's on the person in power. Like it's not on you to justify yourself or beg, it's your right. So when you no longer need to kind of explain yourself, you don't need to be so constantly vulnerable. You're not an inconvenience, you're welcomed. So however, over there, disabled people are resorting to assisted suicide because of a lack of accessible housing. And I want to point out, this is not some far away, backwards other country problem. I believe this is happening because the AODA does not have housing standards. There are no guidelines, there are no penalties. And because there are no specific guidelines or penalties, nobody does it. So this is why I'm arguing we need robust protections. There needs to be detailed requirements for every area of society, from education to employment, to transport, to customer service, to media, to housing, to public spaces, to healthcare. And I acknowledge that sounds like a lot, but it's actually not too hard because you have all the answers. Listen to disabled people. We know what we need to participate safely and equitably in society. We just need to be listened to. Setting up an advisory committee for this just isn't enough. We shouldn't be here. I think we need to be further. I acknowledge that plenty of the wording in this bill is positive, but there's no real substance to me. I question things like why it's just the majority of committee members that are meant to be disabled and not every single one of them. Because again, I will repeat, I don't believe able-bodied people get a say in this. We don't need other people to judge like whether or not something is accessible for us. We can tell you. We just need to be believed. We need to shift that power imbalance. I believe we need a new bill that's developed with much greater involvement from the disability community. We deserve the respect of a fully cooperative process here, and that hasn't happened. So that's my piece. Thank you for your time. I do also want to throw my full support behind Access Matters and Inclusive Dreams in this, so please listen to them. Thank you.
Thank you, Victoria, for your insightful information and also referring us to the legislation in Ontario. Can you just repeat that again? I didn't.
The Ontario?
Yes.
The Ontario's Accessibility Act.
Accessibility Act. So yeah,
Yeah.
Thank you for that, because that's something new that we ask questions around international experience and
yeah. So they've covered a few areas. They still haven't covered education and housing, and so hopefully, and they are behind on enacting it, and there are also problems. But so they have development committees instead of advisory committees. So like the minister goes to each area. So yeah, and it's behind. There are things there that have had so it's not perfect, but I believe they're doing it was progressive when they brought it in, and there is good in there. There is good guidelines. So
thank you. I particularly like the high trust, but we have a question from member Maureen Pugh.
It's a supplementary to your question, Anahila. Welcome, Vicky. Could you explain how in terms of the Ontario Accessibility Act, how that act was informed? So was it informed by the disability community solely, because that's some of the criticism that we're hearing in submissions is that that's not the voice that's always being heard.
I think so. Like, I don't know the whole history because I wasn't living there when it first, but yeah, I know the involvement right now is heavily, yeah, pretty much all. Like, I know the names I've seen, they are. So yeah, but I don't know if it's 100%, and I don't know the development process behind it.
Okay, we can find that out.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Victoria. I'm just going to open it to the room. Tony, you have a question? Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair there. Victoria, I know also that British Columbia is also supposed to have put out an accessibility bill as well. I don't know if you know much about that either, because I know from one side of Canada to the other, but I'd assume that they're probably very similar, if you have any indication of that.
I don't have experience with BC at all. Like, they're worlds apart, different cultures. Yeah, yes.
Yeah, I know.
Well, I know what I've lived and seen and practiced, and like they're getting that it's just a different. Yeah, I think my husband's like response to moving here, it was very positive, but seeing these things not in place was quite a different experience for him. Like, and I think assume BC in general, they're very progressive, so I would think they're on track with this stuff for sure.
Thank you.
Thank you, Victoria, for your information. That there are no more questions from members, and we have a couple of minutes left. But other than that, I just want to say thank you for your information.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, members, the Madam Chair has come back, so I will hand the reins over to the Madam Chair. Thank you.
Thank you for chairing for me, Anahila, and thanks, Vicky. That it's unfortunate I missed some of your submission. So we now come by Zoom to Paul Brown. All coming in. Great. Hello.
Kia ora.
Hello, Paul. I'm Angie Warren-Clark. I'm the chair of the Select Committee. We have your submission. We have 10 minutes with you, Paul. Would you like a description of who is in the room and who is on Zoom?
I don't need a description, but names would be helpful.
Great. Okay. Well, I'm Angie Warren-Clark, Labour-list MP and the chair in the room.
Kia ora, I'm Liz Craig, Labour-list MP based in Invercargill, but here in the room today.
Hi, I'm Tony Southern-list MP for ACT based in Christchurch, and I'm in the room.
Kia ora, Jan Logie, Green MP, hi Paul.
Hi.
And the members who are by Zoom are Anahila, Dr. Emily Henderson, and Teresa Ngobi and Maureen Pugh in various parts in the community. So we have 10 minutes with you, Paul. And if you'd like to leave time for questions, that would be great. So your time starts now. Thank you.
Kia ora, thanks for having me to present today. My name's Paul Brown. I'm a blind person. I live in Tamaki Makaurau. Just for the disclosure, I work for DPA, the Disabled Persons Assembly, and I've probably, I think, been to this committee in that capacity. And while everything I say today will chime in with DPA's submission, this is my own personal one. So, look, I wanted to start with 2 or 3. I gave quite a lot of examples in my submission of barriers I face where either it doesn't need legislation to fix it, it could be done now, or that the legislation won't fix it. And so, you know, from catching the bus in Auckland where you have to flag it down, even though I stand there with my white cane because I don't actually flag it down, the bus goes past me. Going to the receptionist at the doctor's or the hospital, filling out the consent form, having to stand by the receptionist answering her questions in the reception area, when I could have had the form emailed to me in advance. Legislation will not fix that, nor does it need legislation. You know, my daughter's school report comes in a format that's unreadable to me from the Ministry of Ed. Again, this legislation won't fix that, nor do I believe it needs legislation. to fix it. And so I think the bill is fundamentally flawed and not fit for purpose. Because, as I say, I listed about a dozen issues where I either think we don't need legislation or the legislation won't actually fix anything. And these aren't far-fetched, really difficult stuff. These were just a selection of the things that came into my mind that were barriers on the day I put my submission together. And I think you'll agree they're kind of ordinary, everyday type things. None of them are really major. But I think, we can talk about these stories, but we also need to look at solutions. And I would say that as a minimum, accessibility bill must set up a new independent Crown entity that covers all of government, including local government and private entities offering publicly funded services. And one of the reasons I say local government is currently, just now, most transport will not be covered. As DPA led quite a big transport research with MR Cagney into the transport needs of disabled people last year for Waka Kotahi. And, transport is one of the biggest barriers to disabled people being involved. So the fact that local government is out here is a real issue. And that the entity must have standard setting powers of enforcement, investigatory powers, and the ability to rectify accessibility breaches. And I think these are the fundamental things that are missing from the current bill. I'm minded to support the UN Disability Committee in asking for the bill to be be rewritten in conjunction with disabled people and DPOs. I think the intent of the legislation is great, but I think that what we have currently is very, very wide of the mark. I really think this bill, if it was passed, and I'll finish here, would really have no impact at all on the barriers I've raised here and on my day-to-day kind of life and the barriers and issues I experience.
Thank you, Paul. A really clear submission and really useful examples, real world examples. Particularly, just thinking about your prescriptions and how you go about reading your prescriptions.
Yeah, I mean, there actually is software. There's one pharmacy where a couple of blind friends of mine go in Dunedin. That actually uses the technology from the States to do prescription reading. It's there, it's possible, it's not terribly expensive. One pharmacist has done it because he has a couple of blind clients who are a bit stroppy and forceful and asked for it and pushed it. I went to my pharmacy, raised it, and the pharmacist was interested, but it's not going any further there. And yet I get medication that I cannot read the directions of, the side effects of, how often to take them. I just need to hope I've remembered properly what the pharmacist has told me.
Yeah.
That's not safe.
Yeah, absolutely.
And this bill won't fix that. This legislation as it currently stands will not fix that.
It's a really good example, though, of a very small matter that can actually cause death, really.
Yes, yep.
Absolutely. Look, Paul, we've got a couple of people who want to ask questions. Sure. So we've got Teresa by Zoom and Maureen by Zoom. So we'll go to Teresa first.
Oh, kia ora, Paul, and thank you so very much for your submission. It was great, and I love hearing the Scots accent. Reminds me of my granny and my granddaddy, so thank you very much. Paul, I just wanted to pick up on, and look, I know you said you agree, well, you would prefer a rewrite of this bill, but I just wanted to pick up on one of the things that you talked about in terms of independent Crown entity to deal with sort of the, looking at I guess the standards, the enforcement of standards, and just and rectifying the any disability
and
breaches.
investigation.
Yeah, and investigation. Well, I wondered what your thoughts are on that. While it's government, what your thoughts are on how that, if there was a possibility, what would that look like if it fitted within the new Ministry of Whaikaha or Ministry of Disabilities? What it could possibly look like? Yeah, thank you.
I think there's a bit of a problem there. There's a bit of a conflict of interest because Whaikaha is kind of in charge of disability services, and certainly in charge of the funding, and you could argue wider than that. So a separate unit within Whaikaha, maybe. I'd need to have a bit of a think about that. But as I say, I think it could be open to a real suggestion anyway. And remember, you know, we don't, it's the sniff test, isn't it? You know, or the Herald Reader test that says, you know, does this smell fishy? Well, you know, it's a fish. And I think that there is a concern, or there may be a concern within community if this was in Whaikaha about there need to be some really demonstrable separations there so that it wasn't seen as a conflict of interest.
Thank you. We'll come now to Maureen. We're nearly at time, however.
Sure.
Okay. Thank you, Madam Chair. Thanks, Paul, for your submission. I'm picking up too on your suggestion around an independent entity, but what we've got in front of us is the bill we need to deal with. And in your opinion, if this bill strengthened the authority of the Accessibility Committee and gave it some, you know, authority to provide either advice or recommendations to the minister, do you see that that could help strengthen this particular piece of legislation we've got in front of us? And sorry, can I also expand on that by saying that then the minister would also have accountability back to that Accessibility Committee on the response that the minister has to that.
Okay, so I guess I would ask you a question, and I will answer your question. My question would be, so the minister reports back to that committee and says, nah, what do the committee do except, you know, wring their hands, you know, because actually they can't make a change then. They could resign, fall out with the minister, whatever, but actually no teeth there. I mean, I have a straightforwardly, could we strengthen the powers of the committee? Absolutely, I'm sure we could, and make it slightly better than it is. Will that fundamentally deal with the flaws in the current legislation? My gut is no, it won't. I have a concern that I raised in my written submission, that actually a committee could mean that things actually take longer to get, because departments will say, oh, well, the committee haven't raised this with us, you know. Also, you know, if my issue, which may be really important to me and important to blindness community, say the flagging down of the bus. Actually, no, let's take the prescriptions, right? That's important to some of the disability community. But if you can read print and understand it, then it's not particularly important to you, you know. So what happens if the committee don't take that up? You know, actually, we have more people, you know, taking medicine wrongly, with the serious consequences there, just because it hasn't been taken up by the committee. So, you know, I'm not convinced that strengthening a committee will deal with the fundamental issues here.
Okay. Thank you, Paul. We're now at time. Really appreciate your examples, as I've said before, and your submission. And yes, I agree. Lovely to hear your accent as well.
It's the only one I've got. We have an operation to keep our accents, the Scots and the Irish. So I'm not losing it.
Yeah, it's wonderful. Thank you so much.
Cheers.
Have a good rest of your day.
Ka kite.
Ka kite. So we now have the No Company Limited and Warren Forster. In person. Here we have a person in person. Yes. So Warren, I'm sure that you have submitted before into Select Committee, but I'd just like to thank you for your great submission, detailed submission, and we have you for 15 minutes. If you'd like to leave some time for us to ask you questions, please do so, but we are completely in your hands. Welcome.
Kia ora koutou katoa, ko Warren Porter tōku ingoa. I've met some of you before, some many times. I'll just start by describing myself. I'm a middle-aged Pākehā man, bald, slightly overweight, and I wear glasses. I'm not here to tell you about my life experience and my lived experience. I hold several positions, but today I want to talk to you from a research perspective. These views are mine and not of the research team. And there's three parts to what I have today. The first is a challenge to you. The second is an overview of the model that we worked on, and the third is questions. So in 2019, I led a research team and we set out to design a piece of legislation, and we wrote a big long report. This was something that was designed to identify and remove barriers now and into the future. And we recognised that this was really a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for us as a country. The Law Foundations funded this work, which was incredible. They have funded a fair bit of the work that I've done, and I'm very grateful to them. But when it got to the policymakers and drafting of legislation, it went awry. Now, the courts have commented about this House and human rights, going back decades, and they said that window dressing shouldn't be attributed to this House when it comes to human rights. And they're talking about this Parliament. Your house, our house. Now, the courts, like us, believe in separation of powers. This House and its functions and the robustness of its processes and committees. But here I am today, holding up this legislation. And this is one of the biggest disappointments of my career. And I've had a few. Why? Because we had an opportunity to become world leading, to design legislation that will be truly effective at making Aotearoa accessible by designing a piece of legislation that would identify and remove barriers progressively into the future. And instead, we don't have anything like that. When I first met officials, they said we needed a bill and we needed it quick, and that was 5 years ago. And I said, if you want a bill, I can draft one now. It'll be 5 pages long, set out a few key ideas, and I held up the British Columbia bill that was currently being developed, and that's exactly what it looked like. They laughed at me. They told me not to be stupid. And fast forward to 2023, and we're here, and we have this bill. The officials in Cabinet originally had some very strong views on this. They said it needed to have standards, it needed to be enforceable, and it needed to apply to all domains. Yet 5 years later, we have this. So as we said in our 2020 report, New Zealand's had a regulatory system without a regulator for decades. We've had numerous pieces of legislation and public sector agencies. We've had an accessibility charter. This has not worked. Simply coordinating the system better will not be effective. When I went to Cabinet prior to decision-making on the drafting of it, I sent an all-staff email to Cabinet. I've done this twice in my career. I got a lovely reply back from the Prime Minister. I explained the flaws. They thanked me. They said they value my input, but this is what we got. Now, some people blamed officials. Some blame the Minister, some blame COVID, some blame me, some blame Whaikaha, some blame Cabinet. Some told me the legislation was deliberately this way so that everyone would come to your committee who would report back to Parliament. Some said it would cost too much. I've been to more meetings on this legislation than I care to remember. I hope this is the last one. The reason is that I think this bill is particularly ineffective. And like the courts have said, it's window dressing. And it will be attributable to Parliament unless your committee does something about it, or the UN approach is followed and it gets sent back for rewriting when it goes back to the House. Now, I'd like to turn to the bill now, to the report, and focus on 4 key areas. These have been poorly articulated by officials and in the draft team. They were part of all discussions until 2021. Now, the first is that we conceptualise non-enforceable standards. These are things that can be developed and implemented at the lowest level. The second is the idea of an enforceable standard, and this was 3 tiers: a single ministerial standard, a joint ministerial standard, and a cabinet level standard. The idea there is that some things can be done within existing ministerial jurisdiction, some will require cooperation between ministers, and some things, for example, if we were to turn the entire transport system into an accessible system tomorrow, that will need a significant capital outlay to be funded by somewhere. We're not a fan of placing massive financial burden willy-nilly without articulation of how it will be funded. Now, again, all of this is in there. We talked about creating a regulator. We need to create a statutory authority, and that can be done without all the problems articulated in the RIS. The reason is that regulators cannot regulate in a vacuum. WorkSafe doesn't make its own regulations and put them into force tomorrow. In the non-enforceable space, absolutely. They work by consensus, they can cover a lot of ground. We were told that we were making a super regulator that would regulate everyone in and of itself, and that is simply nonsense. That was never the suggestion. So, when it came time to drafting, there was no regulator, there are no standards. A barrier notification system. The key features of this is that we'd centralise lived experience and provide an accessible way for people to notify of a disabling experience. Now, the organisation operating this can use that data to inform the organisation that has a mandate to remove the barriers. And this system will provide the insights and will tell us when the barriers have been removed. Now, the most effective way we said to create this system is have one of the existing bodies, probably the regulator, to oversee it. But we acknowledge it can also be done by the disputes process. So there's currently a piece of legislation called the Water Services Economic Efficiency and Consumer Protection Bill. That's in the House. I've made some submissions on this too, you might be surprised to know. But it's a very similar idea. We have codes, we have a disputes process, and the disputes process is the one that oversees and administers the code and looks and see if things are working and resolves the disputes that arise. Now, the reason I say this is here's 2 really straightforward ways, a regulator and a disputes process that could do this. They exist in existing legislation across multiple acts. And for some reason, they've been completely left out of this. And finally, a dispute resolution process. You've already heard from one of my colleagues, Jess Plachecki, about dispute resolution. I'd like to tell Tuku her submissions and just explain that one of the key ideas that she addressed you on was the specified and signatory entities. Very straightforward way of allowing it to apply to specified entities in the legislation and allowing signatory entities to be brought on board. So I'd like to answer any questions you have on the legislation. And then if there's time, I have a few concluding observations.
Thank you for your submission, very powerful. We have Tony and then Jan.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Warren, for that. I noticed that you mentioned the British Columbia bill. Partly the reason why I'm aware of it is because I've got a Canadian husband and family there. Now, you offered this as basically a template for the government of the time to put up for the successor bill. Is this correct that I understand?
It was the first suggestion I put up. It was a very simple, straightforward bill that had no flesh to it, just like this one.
Yeah.
It was a bill they started with. Now, every province in Canada, more or less 5 or 6 of them now have them. You have a federal system. We looked at the regulatory systems all over the world. They've all been through various reviews. They've all got to the same point of we need an enforcement mechanism, we need a notification process. Well, let's not reinvent the wheel and wait until 2029 when we have a bill in place for 5 years to see if it's working. Like it's not rocket science. This stuff's all been on the table for years since we first started this.
Yeah, and that's exactly what I was going to say about reinventing the wheel. And if there's things already out there that's happening, we should probably really look at that and use that as a starting point rather than necessarily this bill itself.
We did look at using them as starting points. They had some fundamental flaws. They generally don't have a regulator. They generally don't have a notification system. So that's why we didn't go down that path. But the point was that if you wanted an empty bill to flesh out, we could have had one 5 years ago.
Thank you for that.
Thank you. Next question from Jan. Thanks. A few questions if we've got time. We've got that. Great, thank you. So one, I'd appreciate, because that point around the feedback about the perception of it being a super regulator, and you spoke in your oral submission about kind of examples and why not, but I just would really, for people who aren't generally involved in designing systems, it's kind of a complex point. And I'd really appreciate it if you could just kind of really talk us through why that's not the case, and how and the value of this model. Yeah.
Thank you. So at the moment, we have a regulatory system in Aotearoa. Everyone who's developing accessibility legislation, which under the UN Convention is every state in the world, has to think about how it will impact on their existing regulations. So we can either scrap all of the existing regulatory systems that touch on accessibility, telecommunication, transportation, housing, etc. That's one option, and start again with a super regulator. People said that's what we were trying to do. Again, with respect, that's a complete fallacy. The second approach is, and again, this isn't what we said, is we'll acknowledge that they all exist, but we'll create a new organisation that's empowered to make whatever regulation it wants about anything. Again, that's not what we're saying, that's a fallacy. Whether it's a deliberate fallacy or not, we did explain it repeatedly and it somehow stuck. The third conception is we have an existing regulatory system. It needs to be someone's job to make that work. Now, accepting that there's a number of complex bits of this, we can either have a really good navigation system that a disabled person goes to, and it sends them off to one of the 30 regulatory authorities that exist in Aotearoa. That's an option. Again, not very user-friendly. When you're designing legislation, that's probably not the starting point. Or we can say, let's make an organisation whose job it is to articulate all of these barriers that people experience and be notified of these, and then work out whose job it is to remove those barriers, and then go and work with them. Now, assuming that the government is perfect in its design and has covered every single foreseeable legislative system that could create access barriers, we will only need to use the existing regulatory systems to do that. However, assuming that there are some, let's call, a consultation standard or a communication standard that don't already exist, if it's quite a straightforward standard that can be put in place without a huge fiscal cost, that's something that the system could go to its minister and say, hey, minister, we need a communication standard. This House recently had one on the plain language bill. I came and made submissions on that. So that's an example of something that's fairly straightforward. Hey, do this. So you could do that with a regulator. Or you could say, the regulator could say to two ministers, hey, accessibility minister, hey, transportation minister, there's an accessibility barrier in our transport system, or employment minister, or whoever the minister is. Here's what we propose to put in place as, let's say, a non-enforceable standard, or an enforceable standard with these issues and these ways forward. And as we articulate this and we go through and make Aotearoa accessible, we should make a lot of progress. But at times, we're going to get to a point where even two ministers or three ministers cannot make that decision because of the requirements in the cabinet manual and other legislative frameworks around how much people can spend on what things and so on using their delegated authority. And at that point, we're probably going to need to go to cabinet and get cabinet to say, this is a political priority, we will do this. Now, we set these out in our report very clearly. We spend a page and a half explaining it. That is the conception of how we can move forward with the existing regulatory environment in this space. Does that answer it comprehensively?
I think so. Yeah, that was useful. Thank you. One more, and then we've got Maureen. Time is pretty much. And I know that you said that you were open, supportive to the UN's recommendation about the co-design with the community. And I just would like to hear where, because you involved community, as I understand
Yes.
it, in the development of this report. If you can speak to some of the detail of that and then what you think the next steps are in terms of co-design.
So the critical idea is empowering people and their organisations. What we have now, I don't think does that. And unless that committee is going to be resourced in a way to run the regulatory system and the notification system, it's not going to work. So to go to the disabled community and say, hey team, what do we want to do here? How should this work? I'm sure they'll come up with ideas and tell you, as they've done already. And you may see the rehashing of earlier ideas, or you may see better ideas, but the critical things that the community said needs to be involved in this legislation and central to it, and it's not.
Thank you. Quick question from Maureen. If you can get a question out quick, I'd appreciate it.
Okay. Thank you, Warren, for your very blunt feedback and necessary, I think, in this debate. The reality is that we've got this bill in front of us, and that's what we've got to deal with. To be honest, the minister can set up a committee without requiring legislation. And as I understand it, and I'll have to check, but I understand the minister can also set up regulation without legislation. So, you know, in terms of what we've got in front of us, how do you suggest, if anything, we can improve this piece of legislation?
So firstly, there's nothing in this bill that needs legislation to be implemented.
Correct.
Secondly, that's my opinion. Secondly, is that if you strengthen the accessibility committee by giving them functions, powers and resources, and if you had a DRS provider and a set of codes based on the example I gave you and the other bill, the water consumer services framework, if you had those two things in place where you had a number of codes that were developed and these things moved up to a process of someone sorting out the problems that have been identified, it doesn't really matter what you call it, whether you call it a regulator, whether you call it a DRS provider, whether you call it a dispute resolution system. It's the functions and the powers of the thing, and that's what we said in the report.
Sure.
They are the critical ingredients, and if you were to amend the legislation by giving the Accessibility Committee powers, functions and resources and have something like a DRS provider and a code, that would make it better, but it won't make it the outstanding world-leading piece of legislation that we could design.
Thank you. Look, we are out of time, unfortunately. You appear to be reading from some notes. If we could have a copy of those, that would be useful as well. Thank you so much for coming before us and talking to us about
Mātua.
So our committee, we are now suspended until 1 p.m.